Hello, and welcome to video number 10 in a series on leftism and climate change. My name is Max Reynolds, and I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. For more of my work, you can visit my website at maxoreynolds.com. In the last video, we examined Paulo Freire's new model of education, which is designed to disrupt old norms, old society, the conveyance of knowledge, and to replace the education system, the methodology of teaching, and the methodology by which people reason and integrate knowledge, in fact, come to develop knowledge, are completely detached from society and all the methodologies as they exist today. These are all, in turn, oriented towards a certain particular goal, which we understand is the utopian vision of Freire and others with liberatory theology. So their project is essentially to complete God's work from the language that is used. But of course, we must understand that God need not refer to the Christian God, even whilst Christianity is the entity being integrated into neo-Marxism. That comes through from the fact that it's not actually Christian doctrine, and it's not typically referring to Christ. Instead, what comes about is its integration into something called global citizenship, and this is the establishment of a new identity, a new means of having people opt into a different kind of culture, but which is underpinned by neo-Marxist and post-structuralist ideas on knowledge, and then, of course, culture. Today we're going to look at how many of the ideas we've been covering over the past few videos parse out and are integral in some of the statements of people who are associated with Davos, the WEF, and so on and so forth. Environmental social governance and global citizenship. In an early statement in the Davos Manifesto, the management has to serve society. It must assume the role of a trustee of the material universe for future generations. It has to use the immaterial and material resources at its disposal in an optimal way. It has to continuously expand the frontiers of knowledge in management and technology. It has to guarantee that its enterprise pays appropriate taxes to the community in order to allow the community to fulfill its objectives. The management also has to make its own knowledge and experience available to the community. Obviously, quite a few interesting statements in here. The notion that a management has to serve society is not necessarily entirely new, but again, we're kind of framing the management as, is it just the management of a company? No, this is the managerial society. So it's people who are like legislators, celebrities, news heads, and all these kind of things. Essentially, a kind of establishment, a kind of elite. And the idea is to try and collapse the distinction between them and society by having the management serve the society. Now, of course, it's very subtle to make the distinction between what is actually, for example, good leadership practice outside of a Marxist tradition. You would normally have, you've got the British Army's tagline, serve to lead, and the distinction between the two, whether it's the background philosophy which is important in the difference between two statements which can be exactly the same. And here the Davos Manifesto is being more parsed out through leftist philosophy, as we'll see, from the Marxian tradition, and it's going to be a management as in collapse the distinction between the senior and the revolutionaries. And it must assume the role of a trustee of the material universe for future generations. So this is something of incredible hubris. It's basically anyone who happens to be in those managerial positions who are going to serve society, nice vague term about who the society are, but they're going to have control of the material universe and they're going to preserve it for us. So you're going to kind of move out of what you would understand as your current electoral systems and selecting your legislators to make laws, to have a whatever philosophy it happens to be, is now going to be dictated by this managerial class who have given themselves the rights to manage the entire universe across all of humanity's existence. And so all of the resources are to be used in an optimal way in order to serve society. So again, you kind of get this link now already back to Barry Commoner's ideas on how the market and resources and production should all be fine-tuned to whatever the needs of society are. So whatever values or things of value are selected by the managerial classes and not the way that the market determines value. And it has to continuously expand the frontiers of knowledge in management and technology. So what you do is you continuously develop the existing knowledge frameworks and methodologies, and this is done partly, and this is probably my more cynical kind of streak coming out, would be in order to stay ahead of the people who are being managed, to obviously maintain the, from the typical leftist position, to maintain the state of power over the people who are allegedly being served. Because obviously if you've got better technology, you've got some slight advantages. So technological development, much as Murray Bookchin was stating, is something which can be developed in order to gain advantage over people. Historically, this would have been an advantage in military conflict, but here we can see it's management in essentially over your own people, so circumventing the kind of the democratic process and leading into a very different kind of democratic process under the Marxian tradition. And it has to pay its taxes. Yeah, okay, that's kind of something normal, but that can also mean that you create the financial regulations in order to extract the taxes needed to get to the goal that you want. And then the management also has to make its knowledge and experience available to the community. So that would seem to contradict expanding the frontiers of knowledge and management technology, which would appear to keep the managerial class in their position of authority over the rest of society. But it's always a question of timing and how much is revealed, and also how many specialists might be capable of understanding and fully comprehending all of the individual pieces. Many of us can recall that the incompetence of bankers handing out loans to people who were incapable of repaying them led to a massive inflation in the market, and then led to the realization that payback couldn't take place, and obviously the ensuing recession. Now, Klaus Schwab, speaking about this issue, says, a transformational crisis, we overlook the serious danger signals, establish the necessary rules, institutions, change our own morality, need more intergenerational responsibility. And he obviously later mentions social justice as a response to inequality. But the one interesting thing is the admission that people such as Klaus Schwab and other senior managers and things like that were actually had committed many errors in terms of not responding to the information the market was giving them. So, like I said, there's an issue of competence here, and being kind of reserved in the way that you make your developments and not overreaching yourself, and obviously that failed here. And then in response to obviously that lack of competence, then all these regulatory rules need to be brought in to restrict people's behaviour. But it's, you cause your own problem and then you introduce the legislation to restrict things. And then the idea of intergenerational responsibility, well, I don't actually see how that immediately combats the incompetence of one group of people who don't pay attention to danger signals, or who fail to have things in place to mitigate the risks. So the intergenerational responsibility is something else, and that's more of the political doctrine of having moving away from individual responsibility. So you can obviously see how the two are connected. If you don't want to be responsible for the 2008 financial crash, then maybe you have to you're interested in advocating something that's beyond individual responsibility. What that takes the form of, that's left open. And then the problem is that national governments are under the pressure of national public opinion, the temptation to do something which preserves national interests but is contradictory to global interests. So again, we see here, and we've already obviously looked at global citizenship in the previous video, but there's the notion that nation states are something which are, they inhibit the ability to develop something which is on a global level and in global interest. Now, my criticism, which I've offered a number of times, whether it's in my book or in some videos, is that as you gain these increasingly large structures, which are increasingly homogenous, the issue is if one of them becomes pathological, or if it has all these bureaucrats or these bankers which don't pay attention to the information which tells them that they're doing things wrong, and it's already happened. If you get these on increasingly integrated scales, then the consequences of them are much greater, much more damaging. And of course, with human psychology and the issues in morality and things, it's always easy for someone, or eventually for someone, to potentially take control of a large entity, such as a Stalinist figure or a Hitler-like figure. Really, probably transhumanism is the greatest threat about making people obsolescent. So these ideas are somewhat developed in Global Corporate Citizenship, another talk, and the issue is, again, the response to global challenges. And so there's this idea that something which is affects a broad enough number of people, the way that that's classified isn't necessarily defined, but we're just going to say that whatever it happens to be that's in the person's consciousness, and if they deem it a global issue, then it's a global issue. And then, of course, in response to a global issue, you need this global body, apparently. But that doesn't necessarily get around the fact that, even a universal issue needs to be addressed and fixed in particular places. And they see the universal entity solution as being able to manage the addressing in particular places, rather than under the purview of nation states, which can also deal with those issues, obviously, in their particular locale. So Davos is developed as an intelligence network for global issues, and all the global leaders can come together. They have the same contacts and things like this, and obviously be informed about philosophical developments and so on and so forth. So the issues are dealt with collectively, and the solutions are developed by experts. Now, obviously, this is kind of the admixture of business into politics. Many issues do require technical knowledge or some sort of specialist knowledge and education, and have very particular ways about going through the motions of finding a solution and implementing it. But in the political domain, you start to bridge into things like morality and ethics and the way that legislation is constructed. And yes, an expert might be someone who's got a law degree, but the ethics and the morals are also very important. And the issue that you can obviously see here is that if people are on just a single page, or seeing this global entity and reframing the way that they always look at things, so that the nation state is a problem, you can always question about how effectively is anyone attending Davos going to be maintaining their national interest above the global interest, which they are then supposed to hold as the highest. That's one of the moral issues, and then how that cascades back into the legislation and into the policy, the way that the state uses the police against the people if they are in disagreement with the managerial class of their society. And so that, the void of an established universal entity at the global level is used as the justification for it. Okay, in this talk, Klaus says that sovereign power still rests with national governments, but authentic and effective global leadership has yet to emerge. And so what he's saying there is essentially that national governments and themselves haven't been able to step up and take the responsibility required to deal with a certain level of issue. And he's going to position his entity, which is of course Davos and the World Economic Forum, alongside people like the UN, are going to step into that function and to become the entity in which the managerial class exists, and then administers its determined solutions to the rest of society on whatever global issue it happens to be that's decided upon. So due to technology, there's a gulf opening between company and state. The state's obviously got its legislative speciality, whereas the company has a technological, and the idea is to prevent the two solving problems separately. And that's the collapse of the distinction between the government and the corporate. So if you look back at Giovanni Gentili's neo-Hegelian Italian fascism, one of the things is that you collapse the distinction between the collective and the leaders, which you could also see as paralleling some of Gramsci's ideas and what Freire then later develops in his student-teacher dyad. You get the same ideas in the Italian fascist system with the leader and the people, the leader's meant to be a particular manifestation of the collective, but manifested in the legislative body. You've obviously got legislative forms, so the framework of the law, but the law itself still needs to be populated by actual ideas. So you need the will of an individual to tap into the collective will, and then to translate that information into the content of the law itself, and to then apply it to society. Parallel to that, you've also got the corporate system, in which obviously there's collective ownership and responsibility and the collapse of distinction. So there's ultimately the collective ownership of the private sector and of various companies, and they too can be turned towards the social good. Ultimately, in this Hegelian set of systems, it's towards the raising of spirit, or the raising of consciousness towards a known goal. So a key part of corporate governance is the internal programs to promote ethics, moral standards, and socially acceptable practices. Very few people are going to argue against that. However, the subtle thing to add as a bit of a comment on it is that completely arbitrarily derived systems of ethics and morals often cause quite a few problems, as we saw in the 20th century, and they are starkly different from, for example, the rules laid down, whether it's in the Ten Commandments or the words of Christ or the Buddhist Eightfold Path. Those would be deontological systems, which, providing you buy into the metaphysical view of existence, they're absolutes and they cannot be violated. And certainly if you do some of those things and then get away with them in life, the judge outside, beyond life, will ensure that justice is served. Whereas obviously here there's no such thing. And then the socially acceptable practices, that's probably where the issue becomes a bit more political. And so again, you can have this larger entity using certain cultural practices as its guidance for what is right and wrong. And then, of course, that's where you can get the Marxist politics right through the door. And then, in order to be global corporate citizenship, you must invest in community and take part in its management. It's an extension of the stakeholder concept. So again, what you're seeing is corporate entities now becoming essentially an individual in society. But the relationship is incredibly messy, because all of a sudden now you have corporate entities as a stakeholder expanding what they believe is their remit of responsibility wider and wider, to include on one side, the nation that they're operating in, on the other, the international community, and then likewise the world itself in relation to humanity. And then you've also got social practices, and you've got a certain system of morals, which are obviously being communicated through that universal entity down to other corporations. And that obviously if somebody's not complying with what is now company policy, then you say, okay, well, you're not operating within the interests of the company, we're going to have to let you go. So there's some, there's the statement here of promoting ethics and things like that. But okay, well, what's the means of ensuring that people can still exert free speech, that people can still actually try to apprehend reality rather than go along with harebrained schemes thought up by dialectical materialists? And how can you ensure that there is actually an ethical framework that you can have outside of the one that the company dictates that you ought to have in relation to the problems that it deems important? It's a subtle way of getting moral judgment through your workplace to regulate your behavior, at least the way that it will be manifested by dialectical materialists. So companies that practice global corporate citizenship do so by providing the knowledge and technology essential to addressing a particular global problem, or through concrete action through the execution of a coordinated plan. So of course it's the development, it's, find the problem, develop technology, and overcome the problem. Bog standard, function of business. But obviously if it's a coordinated plan between different businesses, you can really question whether there's actually any kind of competition between them, or whether they'd be operating as a cartel. And it's a subtle one, but it's the way in which the underlying philosophy, which is driving the management decisions, whether that's a competitive one, which would be under the, for example, capitalist view of the world, in which you can compete and everything associated therewith, or you get the more kind of socialist one, where there's decreasing levels of competition and more kind of concordance between all movements and thoughts. So you can kind of consider this as institutional praxis, and I'll just leave that one there. And then you've got the active involvement of CEOs, their vision of what is good for the corporation and society. CEOs are, of course, always involved in society, and they vote and everything like this. So, there's a level in which that's completely usual. The other being that they have a certain vision for what's good for the corporation and society, and this, I think, is where you really get to some of the major kind of ethical issues with, okay, you've got people now being brought in who are operating under the idea that you've got to have the emergence of this international body that's going to be granted the authority to deal with global issues. This global body is going to coordinate the different corporate powers. It's going to have whatever ethics, moral standards, and socially acceptable practices which the people at the top of that universal entity determine. That can be fed into, of course, by the CEOs and that managerial class, and then what's good for the corporation society. So the ethics and the morals, may be themselves changed in order to fit the goals of the corporation society. And so there's a great irony here where, the very worst aspects of capitalism, in which there's, actually not proper competition, can be united with what is fundamentally a top-down managerial, what we will see as environmentalist, Marxist system, can quite easily unite together. Because, of course, when you've got the imposition of top-down power so that people have to reach certain conclusions or do certain things in alignment with your beliefs, then, even if those things are stating quite different goals, there are elements of the two which can be dialectically united together, and that's what we'll see. So society is a stakeholder, company is also a stakeholder. What is good for the company is what is good for society. And then number 6, global corporate citizenship integrates both the rights and the responsibilities that corporations have as global citizens. Now that was very interesting to me, because it suggests that the corporation themselves essentially become an embodied individual. That to me is completely anathema. It's not a real living entity. It doesn't feel pain in the way an individual feels pain. It doesn't have relationships in the way that an individual has relationships. It doesn't have that same legal responsibility of an individual to regulate their behavior. Not that companies don't, technically in a way feel pain if they suffer financial loss, or that they don't have any kind of ethics governing them, but conflating the idea of a company and an individual as having similar rights and responsibilities as global citizens, I think is a way of just quashing the ability for people to actually have any kind of role in determining the future of their lives. And you can see that because, right at the top of this talk, it's going above sovereign power to get a new kind of universalist power for those who see themselves as becoming the material guardians of the universe. So in line with the idea of Freire changing the relationship between teachers and students, and the Gramscian idea about altering the contents of the curriculum to reflect more dialectical methodologies and sense of meaning in the world, we have the following, which is Global Education Initiative, together with UNESCO, retrains the teachers, new curriculum, and the important thing to establish there is the connection between the WEF, the concept of global citizenship, and the UNESCO. Of course, we've already looked through some of the UNESCO document. Here now we're looking at the wider Davos kind of aspect of that same relationship. And it expresses the conviction that companies not only must be engaged with their stakeholders, but are themselves stakeholders alongside governments and civil society. International business leaders must fully commit to sustainable development. As the important thing there is that this corporate entity is now being elevated up into the political domain, through which morals and a sense of meaning can be pushed, and that this has a seat at the table alongside government and the people. So you can see really the transformation of the relationships, responsibilities and accountabilities in society, and really the injection of private interests in quite a significant way into the way that legislation, values and teaching and so on and so forth, and the contents of the curriculum can be affected. Now, alongside this, there are global citizen awards, so obviously you want to pat each other on the back, and a global citizen is a personality which uses his or her energy to address the global challenges we are faced with in collaborative efforts in a multi-stakeholder approach, feels part of our global community, improving the state of the world with passion. And it's important to also remember that passion from the Latin root was actually more of a burden rather than a positive, as which it's normally seen as today. But the key thing is that in order to be a global citizen, your identity is reoriented around this requirement to bring about social transformation, whether it's the reformation of moral systems in line with whatever new dialectical academic output has been generated, and always orienting around this notion of social inclusion. And inclusion is obviously once you go through the dialectical methodology of splitting out people into opposed groups who are in a life and death struggle with one another, you then go to the victim group and they are made to move to the center. So it's kind of important to recognize that hierarchy in existing society is conceived of as vertical, but in the dialectical society, the idea is to try and flatten it. So you've got diversity, equity, inclusion, and that's the dialectical movement, which is you begin in diversity, diverse material relations, diverse social relations, diverse positions in all these hierarchies and things like this. That would be a negative form, but you nonetheless want to find all of the relations of victimhood which are associated therewith, to then implement a state of equity. So that's a squashing down, so it's all like a pancake, and then the inclusion is the folding from what's been excluded back into the centre. And the idea of the thing being in the centre is that there's an emanation outward in terms of its knowledge and speech and representation and values, which is supposed to permeate out towards the edges. And of course, this process of folding will need to be continuous because it will be dialectical in its transformative nature. Now, social inclusion, on top of this, is always going to be defined through those terms of victimhood. So there's always going to need to be someone who's made out to be the victim maker. And then whilst the methodology does state that it's always about inclusion, the person who is labelled arbitrarily for the needs of the dialectical movement to be the oppressor is not going to be included. That this is part of the revolutionary movement. So if you were under Marx, it would have been quite clear: revolutionary violence, kill all the people who disagree with you. Here, it's going to be a bit more subtle, typically more kind of ostracism through the union of morality and corporate. It's if you don't comply with dialectical system and morals, then you lose your job. So there's that aspect, and all of these are oriented towards having a tightly controlled movement in which people are open and accept being changed by government and so on and so forth as the norm, and whereby if you're the person who's left behind, you're steadily excluded one way or another. So it's maybe not an explicit revolutionary violence, but nonetheless your ability to live independent of that system can be made so impossible that that's the subtle application of force. It's the yes, you've got all the freedom to choose, but you're going to be punished for it. And then we've got a talk by Bill Gates, who states that We have to find a way to make the aspects of capitalism that serve wealthier people serve poorer people as well. And his solution is to use recognition to supplement the profit motive, reward for right conduct. And what that means is that you can have a existing value system now being worked into the corporate state structure, and that you can have rewards if you act in line with certain morals. That doesn't necessarily need to be monetary reward. That can be status. For example, one of the things in the Soviet Union was that depending on how high you were in the party, it would kind of affect. If you went to perhaps a poor analogy, but one that I nonetheless think gets the point across, is that if you went to a restaurant, you would see a certain menu, and someone else might have a different kind of social status within the dialectical hierarchy from you, and you might see different menus or the different contents on the menu as to what's available depending on how well you've conducted yourself in alignment with dialectical methodology. You take that to the extreme that you get to certain levels and certain menus and options are open to you which are not open to other people. And of course, if you're going through this process of social inclusion, then it's only those who are inclusive get access to these benefits, whereas those who are exclusive or who have standards and principles from the old society which exclude certain things in order to maintain a certain moral standard and a social and cultural norm, well, that can be seen as something which is negative and is not rewarded. When it comes to global citizenship, for example, we would expect to see more of the focusing on the global issues, the non-national boundaries, the inclusion on a global level, overcoming environmental challenge and anything which is deemed unsustainable, and so on and so forth. These would all be the things which are typically more rewarded, whereas anything obviously associated with the past or the old or the previous system and its morals and so on and so forth, these are punished or not rewarded. But the imbalance between the two is it's really skewing the incentives, and it's incentives which obviously drive much of the trade in the capitalist world. So Schwab says that, speaking of Gates's statement, you preach creative capitalism, or I sometimes call it global corporate citizenship. So the important thing is you always get lots of synonyms. There's a lot of pragmatism within this framework where you're talking in similar concepts or but using different language in order to apprehend it. So global corporate citizenship or global citizenship can also be seen as alongside as creative capitalism or stakeholder capitalism. So all of these different little things are linked as this nasty little nest of ideas. And then Schwab goes on to say that we will facilitate it in any case because that's the mission of the World Economic Forum. So of course, if the mission of the World Economic Forum is to facilitate global citizenship, in partnership with UNESCO, and UNESCO is making citations of Paulo Freire, who made the dialectical synthesis between neo-Marxism, post-structuralism, and Christianity, alongside the document citing other dialecticians who were then looking to reintegrate the moral frameworks and sense of meaning extant in the concept of the global citizen with the prevailing religious systems in existence. You can see the connection directly between the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, his his stakeholder capitalist project, alongside and in complete and clear relation to the global citizen. It's an open relationship between the two, and that's the direct connection through Freire back to Gramsci, Sartre, and of course right through to the bedrock in Marx and ultimately Hegel. The business in itself is a stakeholder of our global future. Neither governments nor business nor civil society can address those issues. And the point here is that it's never as an individual or a single sector or whatever it happens to be or individual function. In the with the underpinning idea of social inclusion, you have to have things done at all levels and across the entire set of social and material relations in tandem with one another, working towards the same goal. So you can't have one group or one entity pulling off in a different direction, because that would, qua Sartre, ultimately be a form of trapped praxis in this kind of dialectical eddy, which isn't working towards the ultimate dialectical goal of improving the state of the world. Of course, when we've got the connection between the WEF, UNESCO, Global Citizenship Education Framework, therefore underpinned by Freire, it's the improving the world into the state of utopian completion of God's work. Of course, that God does not necessarily, as we have discussed, mean Christ. That is a different kind of God. And of course, given the Marxist tradition, then the probability of that being the use of anti-Christianity to overcome the previous Christian civilization, that would be step one. And then the chances would be that you would move into the pantheist future. And so if you're moving into a pantheist future, you'd be expecting also to see a significant amount of eco-justice being the primary form of social morality seen in the global citizen. Okay, so because we are in an interconnected global world, we need, in principle, a global identity. That's their opinion. You're going to get the Marxists and communists basically doing that because that's their framework. We need to be everybody interconnected with one another and see into everyone's minds and emotions, and everyone needs to be on the same level. And we need to ensure that we can obviously have, people to say that they're the victimizers, so we can indulge in our sense of aggression, but always in the through the lens of it being for the greater good, and that the ends justify the means. So yeah, that's the contradiction with national identity, which overcomes it, and then which moves into the post-nation state world. Ultimately, is what you'd get a couple of generations and a couple of dialectical phases down the line. So if we do not learn to accept that we have different identities which we need to respond to different levels of challenges, we will not necessarily have a peaceful world, because we will not be capable to address, without the global identity, we will not be capable to address those global issues and challenges. So this, when I heard it, was a bit odd, because it's the notion that you need an identity in order to address the challenge. That, to me, is a bit strange. But thinking about it a bit more broadly, if you instill a certain sense of identity, and that a certain global issue, for example, is associated with said identity, then resolving said issue becomes something which is concerned with your sense of meaning, but could be ultimately go and be tied to your sense of existence and continued life. And the reason I say that is because when you have environmentalism, which reaches its kind of negative crescendo, you've got this eco-apocalypticism, which is the world is going to end. And obviously, if you're positioning that as extremes, then you've got utopianism versus eco-apocalypticism. They're the two opposite ends of the spectrum. One is destruction, one is existence without want. But the two are polar opposites, and neither are the actual state of the world. But where you can generate an identity where all of your morality, form of reason, knowledge is directed in such fashion to overcome the old society and to then bring about this new society, well, having the positive draw, for example, for the communists, for some it would have been the revolutionary mayhem and the murder. For others, it would undoubtedly have been the promise of communism and then the construction of socialist consciousness. Here, you can have precisely the same, but you can have a positive motivator, which is, hey, we're going to try the utopian thing again. We've got more technology. The probability that AI and all these kind of genetic modification and things, whether it's to food or through medical treatments and so on and so forth, this is going to open up the world to a different level of technological understanding, whereby utopian might be more increasingly possible and it's worth trying. And then at the opposite end of it, you've got the negative motivator, which is, if we don't do that, then we stay within the current state system and ontology of being, in which there is always suffering, and then ultimately associating that and the present and all aspects of the present system with the eco-apocalypticism. So you've got the positive pull and you've got the negative push, and those two working together, integrated into identity, so that the person has a sense of meaning in terms of fleeing from the negative, running towards the positive, experiencing the sense of meaning and the fear or the joy relative to the stimuli in that journey, and also at the same time feeling a sense of a new community which is taking part in this world building project. But ultimately, through the environmentalism, the ecofeminism, and all of these different aspects of the global citizen framework, you'll have substantially more pantheistic aspects coming through, and I think that'd be quite clear with the environmentalism. So I don't think that needs too much further explication. Intention is to integrate young generation into what we are doing. So that means that the global citizens being, funded, organised, morally instructed by people like the WEF, UNESCO, with obviously their use of Marxist, neo-Marxist and post-structuralist thinkers in the dialectical tradition. They could be described as something kind of like Schwabba-Labba-Ding-Dong's Green Guard, or, some kind of, movement that's oriented towards a green revolution, which sees sustainability, which would also, you could also kind of map that word over. It's the sustainability of their process of being able to take part in the process of social inclusion and the reformation of human nature, in order that people will come to certain preordained political and moral conclusions. I think one of the important ones when it comes to environmentalism would be a resurgent concept of self-sacrifice for this greater good. It's the idea that, okay, well, if with the negative eco-apocalypticism that you've got to run away from, you have, okay, well, what are you doing to overcome it? And of course you're going to have a lot of people who just offer platitudes, and people who aren't typically going to be actually doing something active in their lives. But then you'll have all of the burden from government, the corporatocracy, and then the poor people below who are just going to groan under this system. You're going to have all of the force and marketing, aka propaganda and censorship, pushing down on them for people to reach certain conclusions. And in my book, I really explored the idea that I think it is women that will be hammered the hardest under the environmental movement, because it's the guilt of having children, and because the implicit association there is that people equals CO2 generation, which equals the death of nature. So my belief is that women will be hit hardest, and in line with this, we would expect to see campaigns to reduce the appealingness of having a family, which obviously raise up the suffering or the difficulty of carrying a child to term and then delivering it, grief of miscarriage and things like that, or even kind of simple, crude and materialist ways of being against it. Not that those aren't, but in the sense of how it will affect your life. Now you need to become a proper adult and have your life in order so that you can raise a child properly in the world. And then things like abortion to also be made, A, accessible, but then B, even to the point of being favourable, and everything that you can associate therewith. But ultimately, we recognise that Marxism is at root responsible for a certain form of dialectical feminism, which is anti-feminine and anti-human, and so really that kind of development of a political and moral framework associated with that is going to be really crushing and denigrating and harmful to women. So I'd also expect that women would be substantially less happy under the system, because ultimately it's trying to reform their nature away from what it is, and in that process you're going to become kind of demoralized, and it's going to have a really strong impact on your sense of meaning. So and one of the greatest sources of meaning in your life is your family, your friends, good relationships, and of course, your own children, if you can bring them into the world. Okay, so it's must take into account the interests, the expectations of the younger generation. So this is something that you see among all kind of manipulative miscreants, which is that, as you're a child or as you're a youth, you've got very limited exposure to the world, very limited experience, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, as they say, and there's not that understanding of all of human nature, having experienced, failures and successes yourself, all the ways that people can treat one another, and really what it takes to make genuine positive changes to very complex systems in which going even somewhat outside of some pretty tight tolerances, can lead to wildly horrendous outcomes. And so here it's, as we saw in the Global Citizenship Education document, basically familiarising the youth with the means by which to use and exert political power. So you don't have that training for the older generation, you focus it all in the youth generation. Therefore, there's a intergenerational divide in political representation and the types of legislation and policy which are being advocated for. That distorts what's happening in the government away from a true representation of the body politic, into the youth, who of course been educated in the morals, principles, form of reason, methodology, concepts, sense of meaning and identity, which has been put into them as receptacles through the education system. So it's essentially a neat little dialectical circle whereby academics, government officials, people in the media and things like this all signed up to this project, influence the children, because that is ultimately their project, and then induce those children to further that said dialectical project. So at this moment in time, given that a lot of this education is being integrated into systems, changing morals and values, changing the perspective of the world, reorienting people's identity, sense of meaning, that which is right, the fear of the eco-apocalypticism and the promise of the utopian sustainable future, all of these things together are a recipe for, if it's not an increasingly fraught and fractured and angry world, it's ultimately one which can repeat all of the terrors under the Maoist and the Leninist and Stalinist regimes, because fundamentally it's from the same tradition. So that promise of the good is really, kind of a deceit, because underlying it is this application of force. You're not given the chance, you're going to be educated into this or indoctrinated into this. It's going to be loaded in, it's going to try and become your operating system, whilst telling you to be fearful of the very forms of logic, concepts, other ideas, sense of meaning and identity, which would help you cultivate a healthy lifestyle and healthy relationship with the world. That's how pervasive it is, and essentially you can look to the 20th century to see the worst case scenario. Part 2, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And that's old Schwab, and you'll see behind him over his shoulder that there is a bust of Lenin. Lenin, of course, being the key architect of the February and October revolutions in Soviet Russia, which in turn led to the transformation of Russia from being an imperial state into a Soviet state, in which the task of basically all the functions of government bureaucracy were turned towards the revolution, which led to show trials, the establishment of the gulags, the kill lists, the death lists, the informers, and everything associated therewith. So, this is the man who founded one of the worst regimes of terror ever to have been seen in human history, and there's a bust of him. Of course, implicit in this, I'm making the assumption that Lenin is a person who is being looked up to or revered in a sense, rather than being someone who's looked at with disgust. But if there was someone, I don't think I'd ever pay for a bust of Lenin or Hitler or Mao. So I think the thing that I'm trying to convey here is the question about, okay, well, what is this person's state of mind, and is it sound? The Fourth Industrial Revolution. So it's the result of transformations in technology and our scientific understanding of the world around us that have developed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. So the pace of development has really quickened, especially with digital technology and the, basically being able to represent the world and store it in a digital format with the use of electrical energy. And the mindset is very typical. It proceeds by, just a simple assertion that everything in the past doesn't work, therefore we need the new everything. And of course, the person who's stating that, they've got their ideas, which they've got their eyes set on. They've got an idea of what this new everything or new things need to be, and are attempting to move beyond the old world. Of course, you've got the managerial class, which is working into this. So the world lacks a consistent, positive, and common narrative that outlines the opportunities and challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, a narrative that is essential if we are to empower a diverse set of individuals and communities and avoid a popular backlash against the fundamental changes underway. So a couple things there. The fundamental changes already underway. So that's when in 2016 when this was certainly going on. And then the issue is, of course, there's a whole diverse group of people. Diverse is a favourite word when it comes to the dialectical tradition. You've got unity and diversity, and these two things are folding always into one another. It's the dialectical movement where you're moving towards unity, but within that is diversity. Okay, so the narrative, I think, was for me particularly key because given the tradition, given the connection through UNESCO and global citizenship, you've actually got an explicit reference and utilization of ultimately the philosophies also of Foucault and Derrida. And if I'm being very picky about the use of language and things like that, narrative can refer to a Foucauldian sense. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is a narrative or a discourse in which the relations of power need to be altered away from the old system. So you break from the old sovereign, break from the old epistemology, forms of knowledge, the way of valuing certain things, the old moral system, and then you begin to establish a new discourse in which all the conversation takes place. Which is also associated with things like the identity, your identity. Ultimately, that leads to, or can be facilitated by, I should say, a deconstruction of language. So you change the meaning and sense of meaning associated with words in order to facilitate that new narrative, which breaks its connection from the old and helps to establish the new. That's one of the key things in Derrida's deconstruction, is that it helps to shatter the common lexicon so that people really at a certain level, and this would be cross-generationally once implemented through the schools, is becomes steadily impossible to talk to one another. Your linguistic descriptions of the world are completely divorced, whilst ironically using very similar words. So it's not an overnight change, but it's a steady change. And the idea is that across the whole world, in conjunction with the global identity, the global issues, the social inclusion, the managerial class, the new system of morals, and your sense of meaning associated all therewith, with your ability to take part in this grand transformation and birth in the world of a utopian future whilst running from the eco-apocalyptic past, you need the consistent narrative. So the consistent narrative in a positive sense can just be the global citizen, but it can also be the establishment of a sustainable world, of the establishment of world peace, of the coming together as one race, as the species being. And it's going to be very subtle. It's going to take subtle questions to reveal the application of force and the hostility within that actual movement, because ultimately it wants to present to itself that it's the positive. It wants to present to the world that it's the positive and the good. But what's going to be clear is that this can only be imposed because it's not the thing that people naturally strive for. It's going to require top-down imposition, the use of power, that people must be forced to think and speak and act the same as part of this consistent, positive, common narrative. And of course, if you aren't in this common narrative, then you are partaking in the world of exclusion, and then you need to be dealt with. And then the next part is to do with transformation of human and human nature. And of course, coming off of the back of the technological developments which are prompting this great transformation, we have now the more emergent threads of transhumanism. So more in the kind of, we'll see more influence in the kind of Nietzschean sense coming through Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari. Now recall that Nietzsche was responding also, although I would say he was late to the party, at least, with regards to, for example, Kant, Hegel and Marx's and Feuerbach's treatment of divinity and religion. So when it comes to Nietzsche, God is dead, and then the problem which instantly comes up is nihilism. What do you do to get overcome nihilism? Because you've just got subjectivity everywhere now. There's no official standard of, yes, this is the thing to value. So that was Nietzsche's perspective, and his way of overcoming that was the will to power. So you need to see the objects and people and things around you as being imbued and engorged with your sense of power, but likewise these things growing you and yourself. So there's meant to be this positive relationship between the two, where you're gaining this strong sense of meaning through the will to power and exertion, and seeing the world transformed by your hand. And here we can see these ideas where, ultimately, if you reflect this idea back onto yourself, you're not wanting to be in accordance with base nature. That's one of the reasons that Nietzsche really hated Rousseau, because he was kind of going back to nature, or just accepting things are they are. You want to step above that. And so Nietzsche was, also quite interested in Darwin's theory, insofar as it reflected a process of willed personal transformation in order to change your nature, ultimately, so that you could adopt these new values, and the will to power being the primary among them. Now, when in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, it stated, "It is in the biological domain where I see the greatest challenges for the developments of both social norms and appropriate regulation. We are confronted with new questions around what it means to be human, what data and information about our bodies and health could or should be shared with others, and what rights and responsibilities we have when it comes to changing the very genetic code of future generations." Now, of course, the genetic code is something which is pretty complex. I'm not a biologist by training, but when you start to mess around with that, and fair enough, there are, errors in gene codes and things like this which are associated with diseases and so on and so forth. But when you start to play with the very genetic code, you don't know the full ramifications until you start testing. I don't know how much of this is going to be a planned model before, or a kind of test and go and pick up the pieces on the way. And given the application of force and the unwillingness and lack of reason when it comes to the people in the leftist dialectical tradition, it doesn't exactly fill me with confidence. Of course, when you're starting to mess around with the very genetic code itself, it's going to be difficult to see, okay, well, the distinction between humans remain the same, and that ultimately is the goal of the transhumanist movement, is to consciously take control of the Darwinian process of evolution and try and direct it. And the issue for me, so even normally, when it comes to the Marxists, you're separating out into victim and oppressed groups. But at the same time, the people who are the revolutionaries always need trying to get the advantage to overcome their opponents in the revolution, because ultimately it's driven by a desire to dominate and overpower others. And of course here, if you can begin to develop technology which out in the world or outside of yourself, which you then make compatible with human bodies, you can reintegrate that technology and then give those individuals now a kind of cybernetic advantage over the other people around them. And so this process of so that might be integrating like brain chips and things like this. But when you start to get down to now the biological engineering and changing genetic code and things like this, you're getting to the point where you're actually making the human obsolescent, that they're redundant, and what comes after is actually not human. It's post-human. It's something beyond the human race. It's something new, which is a synthesis between electronics and then technology and then flesh. And so it's this kind of weird chimerical thing, and what it's going to look like, what's going to happen with it, we don't know, but we are ploughing forward into it without really coming out with any kind of serious legislation or consideration of the ethical issues that are associated with it. Of course, there's a hat tip here to the ethical issues associated with it, but it's just, but there's not any kind of rejection that it might be fundamentally morally wrong, and it might and it will completely upend society as we're familiar with it. Yeah, so I'm not confident that when it comes to these issues, given the moral nuances and issues and the gravity of the decisions and the consequences that will take place, I don't see the proper public discourse around this taking place. And of course that in my view at least is because the people who would be pushing this desire transhumanism, desire a kind of evolution over others, and ultimately that will give them an advantage in terms of being able to dominate others. And of course you would see a lot of censorship and propaganda which would be pro-transhuman and censoring the ethical questions that are associated therewith. Okay. So this ontological inequality, so again, fundamental transformation in terms of human versus the post-human, this ontological inequality will separate those who adapt from those who resist, the material winners and losers in all senses of the words. So people, basically whether you're going to succeed in the new society or whether you're going to be a loser is contingent on whether you integrate those biological and mechanical technological developments into yourself. If you refuse, then you're going to be one of the losers. You can see how deep the ethical thought is. Like, it's not actually going to go and state what to do about said losers. Probably just shut them. Turn off the light and shut the door on your way out type thing. So the winners may even benefit from some form of radical human improvement generated by certain segments of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, such as genetic engineering, from which the losers will be deprived. So again, you've got enhancements in whatever it happens to be. And I think that the way that this would be most likely to come about is through medicine. The hardest ethical, or one of the hardest ethical issues would be to deny yourself an improvement in your health on grounds that the technology and the authority presupposed with the application of the technology introduces issues of such great ethical magnitude that it's better to perhaps not have it accessible. And so you've essentially got two argues, and it's like, no, we actually don't want to improve ourselves in a certain way in order to avoid a certain set of ethical issues. Of course, the transhumanists don't care about that. The point is to just get past the ethical issue and just have everyone on board and have it as widespread as possible. So one of the solutions to the ethical issue is, in a sense, to force everyone to have it. And so it's these kind of issues with the thinking, with the framework, that deeply concern me. But as you can see here, part of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is fundamentally a change of what it is to be human nature, and obviously the morals and ethics associated therewith. Of course, you can kick back to Donna Haraway and say that the cyborg is, that kind of entity which is the center of a blasphemous faith because ultimately when it comes to leftism, there's a dislike of any kind of external objective gauge being set against the person. So you can see how you've got the social contract ultimately in Rousseau to just check out of society and, hey, we're going to build a new one. But of course, you've then got the person who always feels slightly excluded, and so it's just, once you've got that initial rebellion, it's rebellion all the way down. There's a series of Shakespearean plays. I think the series is called The Hollow Crown, and one of them is Richard II, and it's brilliant. And you have Henry IV rebel against Richard II, but as soon as he rebels, once he obtains the crown, it's really this poison chalice, because now people don't show him the same kind of deference and obedience to he and the divine represented with him as was afforded to his predecessor, and ultimately his predecessor Richard II is killed. But once you begin that process of rebellion, it's just the consistent rebellion. There's not any stable ground. Here instead, you have essentially much the same. So coming back to Rousseau, you've got the social contract initially for society, and then when you come to the Nietzscheans, the Nietzschean dialectical materialists such as Derrida and Foucault, you've then got Rousseauism elevated into the other aspects of reality. So they've gone through an extension, intension, extension, and applied it elsewhere to things such as language, discourses, law, morality, so on and so forth, knowledge itself. So you can opt out of what was previously deemed true, and then in order to reclaim a sense of meaning, posit a different kind of truth. And so now you've just got complete chaos because it's complete dispersion, fundamentally at an individual level, and then breaking obviously into clusters and things like that. But ultimately it's the distinction between the old society and the new, which is this dispersion and this chaotic entity that overwhelms the old society, or is intended to overwhelm the old society, and then you get your new systems of rebellion. This all ties together quite nicely when you understand that, okay, you want to rebel when you're a dialectical materialist from the moral gauge, which is Christianity, and then ultimately, of course, if the thing which is seen as, there's an existing society, there's an existing culture, there's an existing set of morals and practices and things like this that you're born into, that you inherit, well, maybe I don't want to partake in that. Maybe I want to go and do my own thing. And so instead of integrating into that in a healthy fashion, there's rebellion, opt-out, but the ultimate thing with the ultimate gauge, which is set against all living things, is death itself. And it's transhumanism, which is the attempt to socially contract out of death itself. Now, in addition to this is the digital aspect, whereby some aspect of the world is represented, in binary as zeros and ones, but we've used energy to create a space which is in the world, but which can be used to represent the world. And then we can interact with not only the world itself, but the representation of the world. And here we see that the intent is for the digital facilitating democratization of information and transparency, shift citizen behavior on a large scale, new set of business and social norms for a sustainable circular system. So again, those are all phrases which are associated with one another on a subtle level, which is that you would expect to see them together from a dialectical materialist or someone in the Hegelian tradition, because ultimately this idea of democratization of information and transparency is not democratization in the sense that we would expect the word. It's making it a handle of the dialectical collective. So democratization is a specific process. We saw that ultimately in Freire. We obviously know that this is associated with Freire, and that we've got someone who's got a bust of Lenin in it, and so on and so forth. So there's quite good circumstantial evidence and associational evidence. And of course, given that the global citizen is a dialectical entity whose morals and so on are populated by dialectical materialist ideas, then yes, there's a good connection here. So anyway, democratization is more in the Freirean sense. So this is the knowledge creation. That's why democratization of information. So it's the methodology and the knowledge, and then transparency. So it's seeing certain things. But, the track record of either governments or companies being transparent is not good. Definitely don't expect that to change, especially not under Marxists and neo-Marxists. And then a shift citizen behaviour on a large scale. Nice to get to see it up front. So that's propaganda, censorship, manipulation, application of force to get people to either adopt certain ideas and to start behaving in line with the demands of the managerial class. And of course, a new set of business and social norms for a sustainable circular system. So that's the cultivation of the milieu through the generation of law and whatever it happens to be, in order to orient people towards saying, yes, we need to build this sustainable circular system, this system of generation, this Eurobric entity of the thing which takes from itself, for itself, by itself, the union of the species being. Increasingly, governments will be seen as public service centres that are evaluated on their abilities to deliver the expanded service in the most efficient and individualised ways. And it's this for me just stood out because it was the reduction of the importance of the individual state. So it's the lowering of the nation state and the ascension of the globalist corporatist union, which is going to have control of supply chains. It's going to have this common moral system, the common political project. And if you've got all of global industry, working together towards this goal, where they can charge high prices for green things, they can feel a sense of power and a moral good associated with it. You've got this recipe for a lack of competition, which is really a burden on people, but which at the same time can become so powerful that, if you've got a huge amount of industry or different nations which have adopted this system all going one way, it's very difficult for you to be the outlier and to resist it. That's true on an individual level, but you could also imagine, if all of the industries across the world suddenly turned and decided, no, we're not going to supply anything into this country, it's going to have an extremely painful effect on that country if it doesn't have equivalent industries already established within it. So this is one of the subtleties, I think, which is going to come out in this century. And what does reducing government do to the person's rights and civic duties? And of course, it's this kind of weird relationship where the person's identity is associated with this new universal entity which is sitting above governments and nation states, but which is basically by social contract being given is invested with the authority by the social contract types to sit above nation states and to take care of global issues. Whereas actually, as they've already said, you can only take care of global issues at a particular level by doing particular tasks. So it's basically a sleight of hand to undermine state authority and then ultimately the ability of those citizens to hold politicians in their states accountable for their behaviour and their performance in relation to addressing those particularities. So now it's not necessarily as easy to hold people to account. Of course, those are the same people who missed all the warning signals in 2008. Those great paragons of wisdom. The technological progress is so fast that governments cannot catch up anymore. Society loses control over the technical progress. So again, here, governments are too slow. Corporations are going to move faster. Our academics are going to move faster. So why not just give us the reins? And so that's reflected in the sense that parliamentary process is too slow. There's a desire for an agile government. So again, what you're just going to see is fewer checks and balances, the ability, more centralization of power. The problem with that is that people are fallible and we make mistakes, and that's probably what will be hid behind. Whereas actually, if they were competent, they would have maintained those systems in place in order to negate the negative effects of the incompetence and the issues of making rash decisions or decisions without as much information as you perhaps need in order to make a good informed decision. So created a campus to have a platform where governments and businesses continuously cooperate, also with civil society, to make sure that those new technologies are human-centered to serve humankind. Profound irony, of course, because of the transhuman aspect. It's not going to be humankind, it's going to be post-humankind, as he's already stated. But the campus is a place where different different people and certain leaders will all get to interact with one another. So it's creating this new club. Okay, so you've also got, that's the WF and things like this. So we penetrate the cabinets. Trudeau, and I know that half or even more than half of his cabinet are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. So basically what that means is that about half of his cabinet are signed up to so they're going to be young global leaders, so that's global citizens. Of course, that's going to be integrated with the UNESCO framework on education, which cites Freire, which is the Gnostic synthesis between neo-Marxism, post-structuralism, and Christianity, which is oriented towards negating Christianity. That's why, obviously, Freire was referencing charity being a form of domestication. That's one of the subtle ways that you can always distinguish Christianity as the higher moral system and the anti-Christianity, which is to overcome it, which is that the former progresses by love and giving and charity, and it has will and reason, whereas the alternative progresses by force, unreason. And that's the distinction always between communism and between charity. This charity is possession freely given. Communism uses force to negate private property in order to take from people to give to other people. So little digression, but the important thing to recognize is that you've got, people in government now who are subscribed to the same system which led to the terror of the 20th century in Soviet Russia and Maoist China, and that this is advertised openly, so obviously very confident with their position. That's true in Argentina, and it's true in France now. So Macron and whoever it is in Argentina, they're always they're gonna be much similar. So multiple governments across the world, have people who are in on this dialectical. I don't know what you want to call it. Anyway, global shapers really have a different mindset. Well, that's once you've adopted the dialectical methodology and everything associated with, your mindset will be different. It really will be. Ultimately, it's a framework which positions the world as being false and needs to be overcome and realized in a new, truer fashion. But the process is continuous, so it's really that. It doesn't matter what iteration of understanding and sense of meaning that one has established in the world. It's that you've actually admitted already, once you're in the dialectical system, that you're going to negate your own sense of meaning. You've actually established that there's nothing that can be held as value. And if anything is, it's only temporary before you already know that you're going to have to wipe it out and overcome it. Okay, so legislative changes, the whole process tended to be linear and mechanistic, following a strict top-down approach. For a variety of reasons, this is no longer possible, so that's referencing government. Governments and regulatory agencies need to closely collaborate with businesses and civil society to shape the necessary global, regional, industrial transformations. So again, governments and people who regulate industry need to make the transformation of society their primary goal. Therefore, laws, regulatory changes, and policies are shaped in relation to obtaining that goal. Completely standard Marxist methodology. What is needed is a regulatory and legislative ecosystem that can produce more resilient frameworks, enhanced by creating more space for stillness in order to reflect on important decisions. So on the one hand, we've got the concentration of power, perhaps stripping apart some of the limitations on government and things, being able to move more quickly, or government delegating things to these external authorities in order to manage the education and the identity and the authority to deal with global issues, whatever they happen to be, whatever they're arbitrarily defined as. And the resilient framework is something which is more effective in maintaining its position of power and goals over the existing people. And then the space for stillness is, I think, just more on a personal level, is to, have some opportunity to be able to just reflect on the important decisions. So that's to go out and assess the material relations and how they're being reflected into consciousness, to take the way that information is being parsed out through society and is manifesting itself, people's reactions to it, and then to adjust subtly accordingly in order to maintain that people are continuing to walk down the dialectical path to the predetermined goal, or if they can't be led to do that, at least to flee from the eco-apocalyptic future which is placed in front of them as the alternative. In the first, everything that is not explicitly forbidden is allowed. In the second, everything that is not explicitly allowed is forbidden. Governments must blend these approaches. So the thing that was being referred to here is the philosophy which is governing essentially the limitation of power. In the first, everything that is not explicitly forbidden is allowed. So that's not how I would have understood things. The way I would have understood things is that government only has the power which the laws specify that it has, that are attributed to it. Because otherwise, it's just a process of negation. If you start from infinity to negotiation, start from infinity and through negation get to a smaller body of power, it's not the way it typically goes. Government always grants itself more power, and that has implicit that they have a limitation on it. It is only by bringing together and working in collaboration with leaders from business, government, civil society, faith, academia, and the young generation that it becomes possible to obtain a holistic perspective of what is going on. And so the point there is to, from each of these different sites within the global or the holistic structure, to take all of the insights and information of those individual components and to have it brought into a productive material relationship with one another, working towards the intended goal. Now, the key thing that stands out for me there is the word faith. And so we saw already in the UNESCO guidance that there was a reference of a paper in which the existing religions would have their practices, their morals, their teachings oriented and materialized in order to serve the global citizen movement. And so this would mean that you would have an increasing dialectical union between the different religious movements. So you would expect to see whatever is kind of common between each of them being emphasized, and then the things which are different between them being denigrated. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to ascend together into this singular entity, and then at the point where, of course, they're roughly all integrated with one another and there's no distinction between them, you've got the establishment of the new religion, which of course is going to take the worship of the material world in union with the transhuman now as its new kind of techno updated pantheist form of deity. Okay. Critical to develop and implement integrated ideas and solutions that will result in sustainable change. Again, similar kind of thing. Raise awareness, think holistically, using democratized knowledge, must have values of inclusivity. So that's just a couple observations on the key things that are going to be governing the ideas and the solutions and the way in which reason is applied in order to overcome said global issues. And it requires collaborative and flexible structures that reflect the integration of various ecosystems. So ultimately, it's the reflecting the material relations in the world up into consciousness, and then ensuring that that's represented in the institutions and things like this, and that these are working to maintain said connection, and so on and so forth. We need to develop positive, common, and comprehensive narratives. So again, if we're thinking back to Aaron Gare and the postmodernism of the environment, you've got post-structuralism. Postmodernism had been, as Derrida and Foucault had established it, been very destructive in terms of ripping things apart, rejecting truth, rejecting the idea that there's morals, and rejecting ultimately science and knowledge, and to then deconstruct these and then to repopulate them with something which has personal meaning. So you've ripped the word away from its original meaning and then made it serve some other kind of essentially political and social purpose. Now, the issue out of that is you can ultimately get an immense amount of fragmentation, even among dialectical materialists. So the Reformation, using the dialectical methodology and applying it to Marxism, means you end up with something different from Marxism. So dialectical materialists can then say, hey, we're not Marxists, look at all our Nietzsche and blah, 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 blah that we've been working on. But ultimately, it's the use of the dialectical methodology which reintegrates and drags new things in whilst reforming, that original core which drove the movement, albeit in a transformed sense. So ultimately, at the end of that, you've got this, the revolutionary movement of Marx, and then you've got the failure, you've got various minor successes through things like postmodernism, neo-Marxism, Frankfurt School, and all these kind of things. But then ultimately, through post-structuralism, you've got a lot of chaos, a lot of new areas that are mapped out and need to be then dialectically reintegrated. So the post-structuralism, you move beyond the old structure, causing a break, epistemological break, as I think it was Lukács and Canguilhem, I think, said that. And so you have your epistemological break with the old, and then you establish, you've got all this raw material and you need to establish something new. So as far as I was concerned, knowing that Derrida and Foucault were ultimately dialecticians, their post-structuralism was merely preparing the way for a new thing which was going to be oriented towards in the future, but it wasn't theirs to necessarily map out the specifics of that or to even necessarily define what that would look like. And then when you've got later people coming up through the environmentalism, it's like, well, now we need to reorient and have a common narrative. And of course, that's about the sustainable future. That's about the system of equanimous self-generation, which is uninterrupted and which is in the right harmony with Mother Nature. So that's your new narrative. That's why you get the ecology, national or the National Socialism in relation to the environment. Okay, so establish a cohesive sense of meaning and shared purpose, and that's obviously got values and ethics and everything that's associated with it that are communicated through that ecological narrative. These narratives must also evolve progressively higher degrees of perspective taking from tolerance and respect to care and compassion. They should also be empowering and inclusive, driven by shared values that encourage this. Again, what you're seeing is that the discourse needs to enlighten people's consciousness and take them on that journey. They need to be preaching the values of tolerance and respect to care and compassion. So that's the thing which is here being used to unify everything. And of course, because this is on a certain level the same teaching as what you might find in something which is preaching love, is that it's going to be very difficult for people to actually look at this and hear these words and then to recognize, no, actually this is oriented towards, or this is from a tradition which has produced tens of millions of deaths, and that this is being used in order to tap into people's empathy, desire to see themselves as good human beings, and people's desire to do good to others. So this is far more nefarious. At least with Marxism, they stated outrightly that they just wanted to wipe out the people they didn't agree with, and that it was an indulgence so that they could go on with their project. This is far more sinister because it comes clothed as good. So what this iteration demands is a far more comprehensively developed framework of reason, ethics, and sense of meaning, which is capable of combating this. But unless you actually know what this system's preaching, unless you actually understand its background, if you understand the risks associated with it, how close we are to violence because of it, then you're going to miss out a lot of things, and ultimately there's a huge risk there for your civilization, your family, your culture, so on and so forth. So it's always going to present itself as the good, because one of the learnings of the revolutionaries is it's actually quite a bit easier to slowly move people through the revolution over years and years and years by associating this with the positive values, by warping people's perception of what is good and what is ethical, whilst also denying them the cognitive tools and education required to question it, which is also why you'll see censorship and propaganda. Okay, so on the basis of raised awareness and shared narratives, we must embark on restructuring our economic, social, and political systems to take full advantage of the opportunities presented. So it begins with the enlightening of consciousness, the Promethean fire, which is associated and entered into your consciousness through the communication of these collective narratives, these discourses, and it's with this new vision, this emotional fire lit within you. You've seen the future, you've got your 1 foot in the future, 1 foot in the past, and you're going to try and drag yourself and all of society in towards this promised future. And now you're going to restructure everything in the world at the same time, because there needs to be an epochal break between the different historicist points in time, the different historicist epochs. So you shatter things broadly, create a huge amount of chaos, and then you're somehow going to establish something which is stable. But of course, you've fundamentally got something which is based on social contract, rebellion all the way down, opting out. So you're never actually going to construct something stable, because as soon as one movement of the Eurobrick generative revolutionary wheel has turned, you come back to the apex point, and then you need to turn again. So Schwab says that I firmly believe that the new technology age, if shaped in a responsive and responsible way, could catalyse a new cultural renaissance that will enable us to feel part of something much larger than ourselves, a true global civilization. So, that just sounds like a Maoist speaking to me. Lift humanity into a new collective and moral consciousness based on a shared sense of destiny. Again, kind of more airy-fairy, Maoism, Leninism, Gramsci, cultural theses here, alongside, the Promethean fire of the enlightened consciousness of the Marxist, with the sense of destiny. So it's really got the meaning aspect integrated into it thoroughly, post Sartre, Derrida, and so on. It's airy-fairy language in some senses, but that doesn't necessarily make it not dangerous. Yeah. And then Ursula von der Leyen, she addressed Davos in 2022. So where we have to be careful is to keep a level playing field, that while the companies who have improved through innovation their products towards clean technologies are not faced with competition that comes from abroad, with dirty technology still cheap, flooding the market, need a carbon border adjustment. So again, they're just as you'd expect with, from Barry Commoner and so on and so forth, is the option of competition which reduces prices is to be negated using tax controls. So those taxes are described as nudging. I mean, it's such bullshit. It's really denying, it's deliberately using government authority to make people poorer as part of this goal. And lastly, we shouldn't be surprised to see someone like Yuval Noah Harari talking at Davos either. He is, of course, a transhumanist. He's got a couple books on some of these things and how the technological developments, they're going to pose ethical problems and stuff like that. So you get the bog standard hat tip. But ultimately, it's seen as a positive, and if there's a whole bunch of redundant humans who are, made into, something approximating, the bow and arrow compared to the modern machine gun or robot, military technology, then so be it. It is what it is. Tough luck for them if they're not going to come on the journey. So those who control the data control the future, not just of humanity, but the future of life itself. That sounds like the statement of someone well endowed with humility and someone well endowed with a moral compass. So, of course, they control the future of humanity and life itself. So, reform any and every aspect of nature in accordance with what the data states. So, nothing is outside of the touch of the collective humanity informed by AI and all these kind of things. So, organisms are really just biochemical algorithms. So, if you really extend that, you could look at it quite cynically and say that there's a dehumanization which is latent in that. But also the idea that if we're just biological algorithms, then, you can take someone's algorithm and then save it on a database, and that's something kind of like capturing an aspect of their essence, when it's really completely antithetical to that. We're not just biological algorithms. Yes, there is data stored within us that can be transferred and things like that, but to have such a low view of humanity it's never occurred to me. And then you will not be able to hide from Amazon and Alibaba and the secret police. So it's interesting, the association here, that Amazon, Alibaba and the secret police, but I suppose Amazon would show, through data analytics and things like that, people's desires, people's proclivities. Social media would probably be closer to the secret police and cancel culture and things like that. But that is something is very much in line with the whole dialectical materialist framework. Doesn't necessarily mean that Yuval Harari is a dialectical materialist. However, he is speaking at a convention whose founder is, quite readily on board with that, and who's got the global citizenship concept in union with UNESCO and yada yada yada. Obviously, we know the connection. So our intelligent design, the IBM cloud and the Microsoft cloud, these are the new driving forces of evolution. So again, there you've got the staggering hubris is that AI is basically going to be given the mandate to calculate what is required in order to manipulate biological algorithms, insofar as it can then lead to the birth of a post-humanity or new kinds of organisms and creatures. So it's really getting down into the playing God level now. We are entering the era of inorganic life shaped by intelligent design. Again, like if you're really strict on word choice and things like that, then you'd say, okay, well, that's probably a Marxist statement, given that for Marx and Engels, it's inorganic life and organic, inorganic nature and organic nature. But here the intelligent design is humanity stepping into God's role and reforming all of life under it. So if you were looking in the biblical tradition, you'd be looking at things like the idea that taking a bite from the fruit of the tree of knowledge would have implied that there might be the possibility of taking the word from God, which is then manifested in the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is that the people had a common language and one form of speech. So the common language, they can communicate to one another and understand it, but the common speech is having taken the word, or attempting to take the word, rename creation, and stepping into the role of divinity. And that is a common theme that you see among transhumanists, is basically man replaces God. So that's something which is latent ever since Feuerbach, but which has its roots in Hegel. And ultimately, if you're a Christian, you could say that anyone who's got a philosophy which makes God subject to the philosophy would have already partaken in that movement. So Harari was competent enough to see that a small elite having this is a problem. So again, one of the ideas that to get around it is you perhaps make everyone have it, would be one potential solution, but didn't really offer any kind of proper solutions to it. But does not trust tools in the hands of politicians, particularly those who are nostalgic. So likewise, not trusting it in the hands of people who would be described perhaps as more conservative. So it's very clear in the direction in which these things must move, and it's always got to be in that positive, revolutionary, world-changing, world-shaping, godlike fashion. So to part one, we looked at Davos and the managerial influence on economy and society. We looked at some of the stakeholder ideas about organising businesses and the reading of morals and sense of meaning through this. And then also global citizenship and the meaning of that, and then the association with the UNESCO framework and the commonality between the WEF and then, the ideas of Freire through global citizenship and so on and so forth. And then fourth industrial revolution. So this was the, again, reorganization of essentially every aspect of life, because dialectical materialists are always modest, and reform human beings, human nature, the morals and things like this, deliberately introducing the evolution of humanity, so you create a class distinction between the two of them. But it's going to be very difficult for it to hang on to the whole victimhood and dominance narrative when you've just given yourself all of the technological and biological advantages which have been obtained at the peak of human technology. But nonetheless, I'm sure they'll find a way. These are the works cited. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it.